In this section, Rosie Campbell, OBE, will explain how and why the National Ugly Mug Scheme was developed and why it is so important. As well as being a leading academic and practitioner in this field, Rosie was a founder of the UK network of sex work projects and was instrumental in the development of the Ugly Mug Scheme.
I'm Rosie Campbell. I'm a Chief Executive Officer of Genesis Sex Work Project in Leeds and Chair of the National Ugly Mugs Advisory Group. The UK Network of Sex Work Projects is a national charity which was established in 2002. And you can see the mission statement on the slide, and the emphasis in that mission statement and the work of the network is about promoting the health, safety and rights of sex workers. The network brings together projects working, offering frontline services to sex workers so they can share good practice and knowledge about their work.
It's not her real name. We've agreed to protect her identity. She started working here after her husband lost his job. Soon after, she was violently attacked by a client.
I grabbed my phone out of my pocket, so he took that and smashed that, and then he just started beating me up really, really badly. And it was like he was enjoying it, what he was doing. He dragged me across the floor and he kept punching me and kicking me and kicking me and punching me. I was laying on the floor. I'd been saying to him, please don't kill me, please don't kill me.
Sex workers are a group in society who face considerable stigmatisation. There's a lot of academic research, probably over 20 years, that shows that sex workers have been heavily judged, stigmatised and placed on the margins of society. This has happened in different ways. Sex workers have been blamed for a whole range of social issues. They've been misrepresented and stereotyped, be that as vectors of HIV, be that as people creating nuisance for residents, be that as people who are not deserving as full human rights and treated quite disparagingly by social institutions, by criminal justice bodies and a whole range of institutions.
I picked prostitutes because I thought I could kill as many of them as I wanted without being caught.
This is a quote from Gary Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer, who's thought to have murdered at least 71 women who were also involved in sex work in the Seattle area during the 1990s. So a very prolific and dangerous murder who targeted sex workers.
If he mistakenly believed that he had only killed prostitutes, then the correct verdict was probably manslaughter, not murder.
This is a quote from the judge in the Peter Sutcliffe trial giving guidance to the jury. Very concerning because it's been read as suggesting that sex workers' lives were not worth as much as non-sex workers' lives and showing institutional discrimination really in the criminal justice system at the time.
It was as if I was dirt. He acted like nothing had happened. I was nothing to him.
This is a quote from a sex worker in Glasgow who was physically assaulted and raped, and then the offender threw a £20 note at her.
I know you're not going to report this to the police. You're a prostitute.
These are the words of a man who raped a sex worker immediately following the attack and as reported to the National Ugly Mug Scheme by the victim.
I've had beatings and they've gone, you dirty, smelly, dirty bastard prostitute, you junkie, and been fucking prostitutes, you're scum.
This is a quote from a woman who was interviewed as part of a research project I carried out looking at treating crimes against sex workers as hate crime, and she's describing many times that attackers have verbally abused her and displayed hostile attitudes to sex workers. What I want to talk about now is sex workers being targeted by violent individuals, and this is, in the research and in the evidence we have, this is very much linked to stigma that sex workers face and the hostility that generates towards sex workers, and also the belief by some offenders who target sex workers that they'll get away with the crimes that they commit against them. I've carried out a number of studies on sex work and violence, and for example in one study in Merseyside, 79% of street sex workers had faced work-related violence, and many had experienced repeat victimisation. There's also a number of multi-sited studies carried out in different towns and cities in the UK, for example Church et al, comparing violence among street and off-street sex workers in Leeds, Edinburgh and Glasgow, and that study found that street sex workers faced higher levels of violence than off-street sex workers, but off-street sex workers were still targeted. Sex work is made up of a wide range of sectors. People tend to think of women working on the streets. It tends to be the most visible, the form of sex work that's most featured on TV and in political debate. But in the UK there's many different forms. For example, escorting, which is perhaps one of the, or if not the largest sector in the UK. Male, female and trans people work as escorts. And we do know, for example, from a PhD study by Jenkins, that escorts experience targeted violence and other crimes. And in her study, particularly transgender sex workers were targeted. That may be a case of that sort of anti-sex work hostility and transphobic hate crime coming together. In terms of crimes committed against escorts, what we know from our experience at National Ugly Mugs is that we regularly get into the scheme reports from male, female and trans escorts about individuals who are problematic, violent or committing other crimes against them. Sex workers have been heavily stigmatised. Hilary Connell and John Lohman have talked about how a discourse of disposability has applied to sex workers, that sex workers are somehow seen as socially and culturally disposable, and that generates real problematic, hostile attitudes that justifies and leads to violence against sex workers. And it's that increasing recognition of that hostility and prejudice that sex workers have faced, and some of the high levels of violence generated and the extremity of that murder, that's led some researchers, policymakers and in Merseyside police forces to treat crimes against sex workers as hate crime. And that's, as with other hate crime groups, recognising prejudice, discrimination, recognising that historically there's been a problematic relationship with the police and that efforts need to be made to improve that, and recognising that some offenders specifically target sex workers, target vulnerability or perceived vulnerability, i.e. they think they're going to be easy targets, or they think the sex worker is not going to report because they believe that they may not be taken seriously, etc. by the police. There are a wide range of reasons why sex workers underreport crimes committed against them. Perhaps a really fundamental problem and difficulty is that historically and still currently in the UK, the police are the agency who can offer you support and protection when you've been a victim of crime, but they're also the agency who can arrest you or people you may be working with in certain sex work settings. So that creates a real difficult relationship that the police and sex work projects and sex workers have to work to overcome. That and other factors mean that sex workers can have a lack of trust in the police and a lack of confidence to report, particularly when historically sex workers may themselves have had an experience or someone they know who's not had a good response from the police, who's not been taken seriously, or whatever that's happened to them has been dismissed as an occupational hazard or something that they were complicit in because they were sex working. So National Ugly Mugs is very much about trying to challenge those attitudes, to build confidence, to encourage police to act professionally and take crimes against sex workers seriously. To send out the message that crimes against sex workers will not be tolerated, to get that message out, to try and identify offenders before their behaviour escalates, before there's repeat offences. So the whole initiative is very much focused on increasing protection for sex workers, and as sex workers are part of the wider community, it's also about protecting the public generally.
What shouldn't be forgotten is that people who do cause violence towards sex workers don't always only target sex workers. We've got a number of examples of people who have attacked sex workers and raped them, and have also gone on to attack and rape other people within society, other women within society. And so the effect of National Ugly Mugs is actually much broader than assisting in the protection of sex workers, because it protects the wider community too.
This is a visual outline of how the National Ugly Mugs scheme works. First, a sex worker is targeted by a criminal and there is an incident. The incident is then reported to us by a member, whether that be an organisation, an individual sex worker, or indeed an escort site or establishment. We then produce a warning or alert, which is sent to our members. And lastly, if we have consent from the victim, we share intelligence with police forces and with the Serious Crimes Analysis section.